Okay, we're going to get started here, and I want to welcome everyone to the session on financing 30 by 30 debt for nature, climate, and people. And I will now hand this over to Sylvia Charpentier, who will be the moderator for this session.
Good morning. I am truly honored to welcome you to this panel discussion. Sandy, if you want to join me here. Thank you. My name is Sylvia Charpentier, and I am a member of the board of the Central Bank of Costa Rica. But the real reason why I'm here is because 30, 40 years ago, Latin American countries went into the deep debt crisis. And I was very young, and I was privileged to work in that negotiation that took about 10 years. And it was in that context that debt for nature swaps were born, the first generation debt for nature swaps. So I really want to thank you for coming, and for those of you who are following online. I am very privileged to welcome our distinguished panelists today, and I will introduce them in the order that they will speak. Dr. Sandy Andelman, who is Vice President of Conservation Strategy and Partnerships at the Wildlife Conservation Society, WCS. Mr. Paul Steele, Chief Economist at the International Institute for Environment and Development. And a warm welcome and appreciation to our panelist, Mr. Malik Aman, Director of the Climate Finance Unit at the National Treasury of Kenya. Mr. Christopher Coy, who is not joining us as yet, but he will be here soon. Ms. Maria del Pilar Restrepo, Director of Climate Finance at the National Planning Department of Colombia. And finally, Mr. Marcos Chamon, Deputy Division Chief at the Debt Policy Division of the Strategy and Policy Department of the IMF. Marcos is joining us virtually from Washington, D.C. We thank you in advance for sharing your experience and insights with you this morning. Also, just before I forget, one housekeeping question. If you would like to submit your questions to the WOVA app, you're welcome to do so, or just save them for a Q&A session that we will have towards the end. So Sandy, to get started with the global context, would you please explain the context of the proposal that you are preparing and the need for innovative finance instruments? Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'm pushing that. Oh, there, sorry. Oh. Okay. So some of you may have seen last week, there was a lot of press about a paper in Science that was an analysis of many, many studies, and that found we may already have pushed beyond 5 tipping points on the planet, and we are rapidly approaching a total of 16 tipping points. So we are really up against planetary boundaries because of climate change. And both the IPBES and the IPCC, those are the 2 science policy bodies for the Convention on Biodiversity and the Paris Agreement, recognize that safeguarding and strengthening nature is actually essential to securing a livable future for humanity on Earth. And the IPCC and the IPBES recognize that there is clear scientific evidence to support the global target that's known as 30 by 30. So this is the target to protect 30% of the Earth's land and ocean by 2030. Now, there's not only strong scientific support for the 30 by 30 target, there's also strong political and country support. So now over 100 countries have formally endorsed the 30 by 30 target by joining the High Ambition Coalition, currently co-chaired by Costa Rica and France, with the UK as the Ocean co-chair. But I believe next week, the High Ambition Coalition will announce a new structure with 12 co-chairs, 6 regional co-chairs, which will be much more, 6 regional co-chairs from the Global South and 6 from the Global North. So it will be much more representative of the actual membership. And WCS, together with Agence Française de Développement as the accredited entity, are collaborating to develop a full proposal to the GCF for a program with partnerships with what's called the Protecting Our Planet philanthropies. So the Bezos Earth Fund and other philanthropies, as well as, in addition to AFD, BMZ in Germany, to support countries in meeting their commitments to 30 by 30. And what's different about this approach is, rather than saying it's just about protecting biodiversity, this approach is saying, following the guidance and recognition of both the IPCC and IPBES, to focus on maximizing the co-benefits from the outset for biodiversity, for climate adaptation. So that's both the adaptation of ecosystems to climate change, but particularly the adaptation of people, and also climate mitigation. And that enhances the well-being of Indigenous people and local communities. And as we'll discuss more, less than 10% of climate finance has actually reached Indigenous people and local communities, and this is something that has to change. And so our aim with this program that we hope to develop is to support governments, but in partnership with and also respecting the rights of Indigenous people and local communities. So this really, the financing presents a challenge. Currently, 60% of low-income countries and 30% of middle-income countries are at high risk of debt distress. This means, countries are struggling to make their debt servicing payments. Many can't afford to make investments in food security, in health, or education. So how are these countries going to invest in climate and nature? And so what we want to discuss here in a conversation is, how can this debt be not only a challenge, but also an opportunity and an enabler for financing 30 by 30. Paul?
Thank you. Thanks, Sandy. So you introduced debt as an enabler. I would like to ask Paul Steele. Paul, so how do debt for nature swaps actually work? Shall you walk us through the mechanisms and its variants and interesting reflections going forward?
Thanks. If my PowerPoint could please be put on there. So as Sandy was explaining, the challenges that many countries are facing this what we've been calling the triple crisis in some of the work that I've been doing with colleagues at the International Institute for Environment and Development, which is a think tank based in the UK. So it's a triple crisis of debt distress, of climate emergency, and of nature loss. So as Sandy explained, how can we turn this triple crisis from a crisis into an opportunity? So first of all, what are debt instruments for climate and nature, and how can they help and facilitate your country? Debt for climate and nature program swaps, and I'll come back to how to make them programmatic, are where a creditor allows the debt, and it could be, as I was just discussing with some Bangladeshi colleagues from the Ministry of Finance, both your principal and your debt servicing could be reduced either by conversion to a local currency or paid at a lower interest rate or some form of debt write-off. And this could also be linked, depending on your credit rating and your position in the markets, to some form of debt rollover or to some new issuance of bonds. And then the idea is that the money saved or the debt repayments reduced are then invested in poverty and growth linked climate and nature action. So that could be climate resilience and adaptation, as we were discussing yesterday. It could be emissions mitigation, or it could be biodiversity protection in the context of 30 by 30, as Sandy was stressing. And this will all help to improve growth linkages, which will also reduce improve debt sustainability, which, as we will hear from Marcos from the IMF, is so important to improve your future debt position. So what are the economic benefits of a debt swap? Obviously, it's context specific, depending on your country. But first of all, there should be some improvement in your fiscal space, and your government budget could be expanded, because as I'll come to later, the way these debt swaps work or debt instruments work is that as long as you achieve your key performance indicators, you can use the money saved or the debt repayments reduced, not just for climate, but for other priorities of the government, such as health or infrastructure or so on, so that they could be other priorities that the Ministry of Finance and the government has could also be used with this fiscal space. They could also be investment for climate and nature increased. I've already mentioned that growth could be increased with sustainable investments. We all know that in many cases, investing in climate and nature is good for sustainable growth. There could obviously be a reduction in the debt stock, as I've already mentioned, to improve debt sustainability. And then in some cases, there could be a decline in poverty through pro-poor investments. So how do we get to large-scale debt for climate and nature swaps? So far, debt swaps, and many of you will be familiar with these from the 80s and 90s, particularly actually Sylvia was involved in Costa Rica and elsewhere in designing these in Latin America in the 80s, and then more recently in Seychelles in 2018. These have been somewhat smaller projects, often administered by trust funds with international NGOs, which have been important, but they often take a while to negotiate and have what economists call high transaction costs. The administrative costs of undertaking all the negotiations and monitoring and so on can be relatively high. So the challenge is, how do we upscale them to make them much larger in the future? And there are three ways to upscale them. First of all, to involve all your creditors in your portfolio. Secondly, to link to key performance indicators. And thirdly, to channel the money through the government budget, or what is known as budget support. Those of you from ministries of finance and other parts of government will be familiar with that term. So using budget support, where the funds go through your own budget, allows for a larger amount of funds to be channeled because of the transaction costs being lower through the budget. It can increase debtor government ownership, and if depending on how your parliament and legislative process works, it can increase accountability to the national citizens. So the swap as budget support can be managed, and I'll come back to this in the next slide, as performance-based payments where agreed policy commitments can be linked to key performance indicators or KPIs, which are drawn from your, in the case of climate, from your nationally determined contribution or your NDC. And in the case of biodiversity, some of you may have heard of national biodiversity strategies and action plans. They're not as well known as NDCs, but they're the same concept for biodiversity and nature. So how do we go about these performance-based payments? And this could apply both to new bonds as well as swaps. So as I said, they could be linked to key performance indicators, and you may already be aware that there are many examples of these in your country. The IMF has balance of payments and macroeconomic support, and more recently has set up the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, which Marco from the IMF in a moment can explain a bit more about if it's relevant in questions. And that's paid in installments linked to policy actions and periodic reviews. Then the World Bank and other regional development banks have development policy-based lending, which are linked again to results-based payment. The European Union has budget support in many of your countries, and Norway, in the case of reduced emissions for deforestation and forest degradation, or REDD+, again uses results-based payment. And these approaches are being proposed by the Caribbean in their proposals to by ECLAC and others, and in the LDC Life AR program of IID and others. So this is my final slide. What are the incentives for creditors? It's all very well for you as countries that are facing debt issues to request this approach, but what are the incentives for creditors to grant you this approach? And I think there are a number of these, and we'll see that the interest is growing in the international community. For the Paris Club, it provides a way of offering finance for climate. It can also reduce the post-HIPC lack of debt sustainability, which was an issue with the highly indebted poor country initiative. There's been increased debt distress, so this can improve that. For China, which is a co-host of the UN Biodiversity Convention jointly with Montreal at the end of the year, it can also provide finance for biodiversity in the context of 30 by 30, as Sandy was explaining. And then for private creditors, which many of you will have in your country, it can increase, as I mentioned, debt sustainability, so that although they're already facing haircuts, they can align with sustainable investment commitments and possibly generate some emission credits. So I'll stop there and look forward to questions and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you very much for sharing your experience. So when we designed this panel, we wanted to bring not only expert and context, but bring practitioners, expert practitioners from the field to share their own experiences and how things really look in the field. So let me start with Kenya. Kenya is a country committed to 30 by 30, but in addition to the COVID pandemic, has been contending with the longest drought in at least 40 years, resulting in over 4 million people experiencing acute food insecurity. In this context, it is my pleasure to invite Mr. Malik Aman to explain the challenges Kenya faces in financing 30 by 30 and how you plan to tackle them. Welcome, Malik.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. I'm Malik Aman from National Treasury Kenya, Head of Climate Finance Unit, and I'm going to give you an experience of what we're doing on climate finance and climate action in Kenya. As you all know, Kenya's annual contribution to greenhouse gas emissions is less than 0.1%, and yet we, like many other African countries, face the greatest impact in terms of the impacts that climate change has on the livelihoods and the economy and sustainable development. This is largely because of the fact that Kenya is dependent on climate-sensitive sectors such as agriculture, water, energy, forestry, wildlife, and tourism. And we've had prolonged droughts that have had very, very grave impacts on these sectors. Our NDCs indicate that these impacts actually cause a loss of 3 to 4% of the GDP, the country's GDP. And it will cost us about $62 billion to meet these NDC targets in Kenya. 13% of this $62 billion will be through budgetary support. So you can see the commitment that Kenya has in terms of meeting its NDCs. With the shortfall of the 100 billion promised to LDCs for climate finance and the current global economic turmoil occasioned by the COVID-19 and the war in Ukraine, clearly there is a need to find innovative ways of financing this, finding innovative climate finance mechanisms. As a country, of course, we've made great strides in creating an enabling environment for climate finance flows. We have the Kenya Climate Change Act 2016, which really underpins everything. The National Climate Finance Policy, and we've mainstreamed climate change into our medium-term plans and the medium-term expenditure frameworks within the sectors. However, we're also cognizant of the global economic situation. So additional finance flows towards climate change and environment has to compete for fiscal space with other priority areas like health, for instance. Of course, with the climate, due to the impacts of climate change, health becomes even a priority to finance. Agriculture, infrastructure. So definitely there is a need to look for innovative financing mechanisms to draw in climate finance. We've tried several cases of financing instruments like payment for ecosystem services to protect and conserve critical ecosystems and critical landscapes. We've explored carbon markets, green bonds, among others, to address the pressing climate mitigation and adaptation needs, including green fiscal incentives like tax concessions. Kenya has prioritized broadening the sources of finance for scaling up nature-based solutions for mitigation in the updated NDCs and the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan, which Paul has just mentioned. Therefore, we are open to exploring financing opportunities that can support Kenya's initiative in mobilizing additional climate finance to meet the cost of meeting the NDCs. And that's why we're quite keen and interested in knowing more and about the debt swaps, which have worked particularly in Latin America. So if there's a way to look at Kenya's debts positively with a climate lens, to see how it can be restructured, refinanced, reduced, and the amounts that would have been paid channeled towards conservation and climate action, I think that is something that would be very much welcome, but we would want to see the experience in other countries first, because we've not really explored this area. It's a new area. I mean, it's been there, but it's not been explored in Kenya. And I think there's great opportunity for that in doing adaptation, afforestation, reforestation. Kenya is, you know about Kenya's wildlife and the protected areas. So I think this is an area that would come in quite handy. So we acknowledge that creating a low carbon climate resilient future demands strong collective action and cooperation, as well as steady and predictable mobilization of financial resources. So we are ready to work. We are ready to endorse the 30 by 30 ambitions, and we are ready to learn from this whole experience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Malik. Thank you so much. Thank you for setting the scene, because the situation that he described is exactly the situation that many of our countries are facing. Exactly. We don't have the fiscal space after COVID with high fuel prices, high food prices. Where do we get the money to finance 30 by 30? Climate, nature, and people. And now it is my pleasure to welcome His Excellency. I am very glad that you were able to join us, Mr. Minister Christopher Coy. And Belize has been in the news lately for its recently completed Debt for Nature transaction to finance 30% of ocean conservation. So, Mr. Minister, we are very glad that you are here, and we would like to know from the government's, point of view, what are the lessons learned in the negotiations in designing and closing the transaction that you just finished?
Thank you. I think for us, it's best to go through the experience, and out of that we can look at some of the lessons learned. First, I have to speak on our context. Our context being a small, vulnerable country, highly exposed to climate events, extreme climate events, and we are experiencing the effects, the fallout of climate change on an ongoing basis. At the same time, we have the twin challenge of high debt, in part because of the challenges with addressing post-disaster reconstruction. We have, over the years, acquired debt to the point of distress levels. At the end of 2020, our debt to GDP ratio had reached 133%. As suffering from 4% of GDP average annual losses, that will be where we ultimately end up. So as a small, vulnerable country with high debt, it is very difficult for us to attract financing for resiliency building, much less financing for development. We're not an investment grade jurisdiction, I should put it that way, being high risk. So for us, looking at that landscape or those lens, it's a difficult task to see our way through those challenges. Nonetheless, appreciating the biodiversity that Belize has, the climate consciousness of our people, it has, we chose the path of looking at how we can address our debt through utilizing our relationship with the environment and how we can leverage that relationship with the environment. So towards the end of 2020 and leading into 2021, we were in the midst of the COVID pandemic, already with high levels of debt, unsustainable debt. We had built a relationship with the Nature Conservancy over many years. I think the Nature Conservancy's first Debt for Nature swap was actually in Belize back in 2001, when that effort enabled the protection of tens of thousands of forests. But this was a different story that we embarked upon in 2020, 2021. And that was looking at where we are, what are the immediate challenges that we face in the midst of the COVID pandemic. We were suffering an economic contraction of around 17% in 2020. Our revenues suffered a shortfall of around, government revenues of around 40%. So we were drowning. So we had to do something. This was a change of government, a new administration at the end of 2020. So in part, as we look through what we were able to accomplish, I think it's important to appreciate that difficult decisions had to be made, and that cost political capital. So having the discipline, the underlying political will, I think was fundamental to the success, the ultimate success of the Blue Bond transaction. But going through that process, looking at that relationship with the Nature Conservancy, you had, I think, previously referenced the Seychelles experience. We, in fact, reached out to Seychelles and tried to get an appreciation of their experience and looking at what we needed to do. But certainly we had to focus on debt restructuring. With that unsustainable level of debt, we had to look at debt restructuring and debt reduction in particular. So we had a parallel negotiation process with the Nature Conservancy and with our creditors. We focused on our external commercial debt, which represented roughly 25% of our entire debt. And having those discussions, initially we didn't have the capital to negotiate for any buyout of that debt. And obviously not being investment grade, we wouldn't be able to access that money in the market to pay out the debt. So we initially initiated a renegotiation process for a debt exchange. So we made a debt exchange offer. When we reached a point in our negotiations with the Nature Conservancy that we felt the terms were reasonable enough, both in terms of financial commitments as well as conservation commitments, it was only at that point in time that we integrated the process of negotiation with our creditors and with the Nature Conservancy at the same time. That is when we shifted from an exchange offer to a cash buyout offer. In that process, or during that process, we started implementing our homegrown economic recovery plan. And that necessitated or involved taking fiscal consolidation measures, in particular, slashing expenditures. We took a very difficult decision, and we have to forever be thankful at the same time for the sacrifices of our public officers, in that we went through a process of adjusting wages, reducing wages by 10%. As expected, public officers and teachers weren't happy about that. They went on strike for a couple of months, but we maintained our commitment to that process. And that commitment on the part of the government gave this new government credibility. Credibility so much in the sense that it the IMF acknowledged the effort that Belize made and supported the measures that were being taken by the government at the time. Now, in negotiating with creditors, the playbook, if you can put it that way, the playbook in some sense is to say, okay, you can't afford to pay your debt. Well, you need to speak with the IMF. But we had already spoken with the IMF. We had already garnered the support of the IMF. So then they had to speak with us. So having that level of credibility meant that we were in a position to negotiate directly with the creditors without intervention from outside. And that meant that we could effectively negotiate an arrangement that made sense for Belize and for the long-term economic and fiscal path that we are focusing on achieving. Ultimately, the results were significant. We were able to negotiate a 45% discount on our entire external commercial debt. At the time, that was roughly $553 million. And I mentioned that our debt to GDP ratio was at the level of 133%. By virtue of that transaction, our debt to GDP ratio automatically reduced by 25% to 108%. Our total debt, in effect, reduced by 12%. The conservation commitments at the same time that Belize committed to, we had already made commitments on various initiatives. I think the reference is to the 30 by 30. We had already committed to that initiative, but under the blue bond transaction, that was ramped up or moved up in terms of our commitment to 30 by 2026. So that is one of the key conservation commitments that form part of our blue bond / blue loan transaction. In terms of absolutes, our debt, we reduced that debt in terms of that discount from 553 into a new blue loan arrangement of 364 million. That 364 million included the full discount of the 45%, but with add-ins to cover a pre-funding of our endowment of the Conservation Trust Fund that was established out of that blue loan transaction. That Conservation Trust Fund that was established, roughly 23.5 million was the pre-funding, but at the same time, Belize committed to $4 million a year out of its budget towards that Conservation Trust Fund. So ultimately, it pulled together 180 million over 20 years to look at marine conservation projects, financed not in 20 years, but from now into perpetuity, given the buildup of that endowment fund. So certainly it was a significant transaction. I think it's the largest blue bond transaction in the world to date. I'm sure that it is something that can be adapted by other countries. But in going into the matter of lessons learned, we could not have done it without having that political commitment. For one, that's absolute. But second, the partners that played a key role in this process include obviously the Nature Conservancy through their finance arm, the Nature Vest, that played a role not only in arranging, but in providing equity in the subsidiary itself that financed or that funded the blue loan. It is behind that where we have the blue bond component that issued ESG-linked bonds to the private sector through the assistance of a second partner, I would say, Credit Suisse. But to make it really happen, we have to be thankful to the US's Development Finance Corporation. They provided the political risk insurance so that effectively Belize government risk was converted into US government risk. So by that insurance, our bond transaction became investment grade. And I think Moody's rated at AA2 investment grade, which expanded the interest of private bondholders or private investors. So that I think that partnership and the political will play an important role in making this transaction come to fruition. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. That was really useful and really interesting. Thank you. Congratulations, because I think that you've outlined really the underlying conditions that all countries need to able to carry this out. Fiscal discipline is there as well. So political commitments, good partners, the right kind of debt. Sometimes countries just don't have the right kind of debt to do the transaction. So thank you very much for your reflections. And now we have Colombia. So Colombia is a country that has also done debt for nature swaps in the past. I'd like to welcome Ms. Maria del Pilar Restrepo and ask her to share her experience on how to make the benefits of a debt for nature swap sustainable, and also what policy frameworks you deem most relevant in the context of nature, climate, and people. Welcome, Maria del Pilar.
Thank you. Thank you for this invitation to share the experience of Colombia in debt swaps. I would like to share the experience of Fondo Acción that is a successful example in Colombia. We actually have the technical director of Fundación here in this room. And I would like also to give some insights regarding the implementation of this mechanism in Colombia. So Fundación was created in 2000 as a financial facilitation mechanism and became the administrator of the first debt for nature swap in Colombia that was signed between the US and the Colombian governments, where resources have been used to promote activities to preserve, protect, and manage the country's natural and biological resources in a sustainable and ecologically viable manner. So during these 22 years, the US government has facilitated the investment of more than $60 million through different initiatives and projects that have reached all regions of the country. In 2004, like years later, the governments of the United States and Colombia signed a new debt for nature swap that seeks to conserve, protect, restore, and promote the sustainable use of tropical forest in Colombia by supporting civil society initiatives with the direct participation of local communities such as indigenous communities, Afro-Colombian communities. So the Tropical Forest Conservation Agreement for Colombia is also managed by Fundación and is supported by 3 NGOs, the World Wildlife Fund, the Nature Conservancy, and Conservation International. In this initiative, an investment of $10 million have been made to work in 3 strategic forest areas of the country that are located in hotspots of deforestation. This initiative is also intervening in an area of more than 900,000 hectares and generated more than 900 conservation agreements. I also want to share one of the most successful examples of how the for nature swaps work, and the great potential of the swaps is, in the management of Malpelo Marine Protected Area. In 2008, the Malpelo Endowment Fund was created, adding contributions from the Global Conservation Fund of Conservation International, and becoming a benchmark for sustainable financing for the conservation of protected areas in Colombia. So the conservation of Malpelo, led by the National Natural Park System in association with the Malpelo Foundation, has allowed the protection of 2.8 million hectares and the endangered species. So in these 11 years, this mechanism has provided more than $2 million for the conservation of this sanctuary, and has an endowment fund whose yields guarantee a significant annual financial contribution to the long term of the management of this sanctuary. So here we can see that these debt swaps managed by the Fundación have been successful, and they are also sustainable thanks to a governance scheme that where Fundación acts as the private sector and can invest strategically in these endowments. And on the other side, the Colombian government, in this case, the National Planning Department, we participate in the board of the Fundación, giving guidelines on how to invest in these endowments. We also try to align this investment with the national conservation and climate change priorities. Fundación also engage the local communities in the decision-making process. They are also participating in the governance of each project. All the projects are also aligned to the climate policies and the environmental policies of Fondo Acción, following ESG standards. So this is one of the main how these debt for nature swaps have been successful. And Fondo Acción is also making progress in the creation of an impact investment fund that maximizes benefits to the most vulnerable populations. So on the other side, the Colombian government has shown interest in implementing debt for climate swaps. For example, the former President Duque mentioned it in his speech at the COP26, as did President Petro this year in his inauguration speech. And this is because Colombia has a great potential to implement this kind of debt for nature swaps. And also being a middle income country and a member of the OECD makes Colombia that is becoming more and more indebted, and the opportunity to access grants is decreasing. However, and I would like to highlight that it is important to consider that debt for nature swaps can also take years to negotiate, which can be very, very expensive. And it also increases the transactional costs. Negotiations between debtor and creditor countries on the scope of conservation areas are particularly slow. Delays increase the cost of operations, and even after a throughout process, negotiations may not reach a satisfactory conclusion. So we also seen that that debt swaps shouldn't be taken as a debt relief mechanism, particularly related to debt for climate swaps that have different contributions and different conditions. And it is important to assess whether or not the debt for climate swaps are more efficient than grants in terms of subsidizing climate actions, particularly in adaptation actions. And it's also necessary to know if the fiscal risks are high of each country. So in Colombia, for example, the Ministry of Finance has carried out a preliminary analysis of the sovereign debt that Colombia currently has. And what we have realized is that much of this debt doesn't qualify for debt for climate swap. Which creates a big challenge on how to apply this financial instrument in the coming years in Colombia. So thank you very much.
No, thank you, Maria del Pilar. Thank you so much, because this is another example of a real country that has done debt for nature swaps, that is faced with a challenge. And so how do you go about it? So we are a little bit short of time, and we have Marcos Chamon waiting. Marcos, thank you very much for joining from Washington, D.C. in your evening.
Thank you. Good morning.
The Zoom link, please.
I can share the, let me know if you can see it.
Marcos, welcome.
Yes.
Welcome, and thanks for waiting.
No, thank you. Thank you so much for accommodating my virtual presence. I wish I could be there with you, but unfortunately that was not possible. But I really appreciate the opportunity to be participating in the event. Here to present some work on that for climate swaps with colleagues of the fund. And there's a recent working paper that just came out in which the presentation will draw upon. So if this is something that's of interest to go into a bit more detail, the working paper is out. just trying to, okay, I can move the slides. So for the presentation, just want to briefly, in the 5 minutes that I have, lay out the theoretical case for swaps and why and how we can go about scaling them up. There are many countries where debt and climate problems are closely linked, which has sort of sparked this interest on swaps as a potential way to tackle both problems. And what the paper does is whether there's indeed an economic case for trying to bundle the solution of the debt and climate problems, and how do the swaps compare with other instruments in the climate finance toolkit, and then if so, whether or not swaps should be promoted. We are assuming that swaps take the form of conditional debt relief that is provided by a limited set of creditors, and we can then compare how they fare relative to conditional grants or more comprehensive debt relief. So we start off by discussing how swaps compare to conditional grants. And here, maybe one important difference is that the conditional grants would generally be better at ensuring that whatever investment the donors want to support will be achieved, because they can be structured in a way that they're disbursed as the climate action is implemented, which is in a way that insulates that investment from other developments in the economy, including the servicing of debt. And that's a bit tricky, harder to achieve with the swaps, where the climate commitment may be subject to the same type of sovereign risk that the rest of the debt will face. So there's this question, the country, if you have a situation where the country does not have enough resources to both cover its debt service and the commitments under the swap, which one would take precedence? Particularly the concern that the swaps could end up subsidizing the rest of the creditors. And one way that we show in the paper that we can try to address this concern is by making the climate commitment de facto senior to that service. If that is possible, and that is a big if, then swaps could, in principle, even be preferable to grants, but in some cases. And then we have the question of what to do when that is unsustainable. If a country has a situation where that is unsustainable, then it needs a sufficiently deep debt treatment that can restore sustainability. And it generally makes sense to first focus on restoring that sustainability through that treatment, and then only then supporting climate investments through other instruments, such as climate conditional grants or loans. But we can also have situations where climate actions can materially reduce sovereign risk. For example, countries are particularly vulnerable to natural disasters and investments on adaptation, in which case there can be an economic efficiency case for including some climate conditionality as part of the restructuring framework. And in that case, a swap involving only a subset of creditors could still be efficient if it provides enough relief to substantially reduce the debt risks to the point of restoring sustainability, while avoiding some of the other costs that would be incurred under more comprehensive restructuring. And beyond all these considerations, and perhaps more importantly, there's also a pragmatic case for that for climate swaps, to the extent that maybe grants may not be on the table, especially for depending on the level of income of the country, and comprehensive debt relief may also not be on offer, but that swap may be. So this idea that there might be a range of countries where maybe other options are not as available, but that for climate swaps might be. So then we have this question that there might be a somewhat narrow perimeter where actually using swaps would be efficient. But if that is the case, how can we enhance the impact of swaps by scaling them up? And here we have some challenges. So debt for nature swaps have been around for over 30 years, but both the number of transactions and the amount of debt treated has remained somewhat limited. And there's factors that have been hindering the takeoff of swaps, such as the complexity of the transactions and the high monitoring costs that can be involved. In the paper, we propose 5 ways in which we could implement policies that would help scale up the use of swaps. Among them includes the bundling of projects and aligning them with the country's climate agenda, where some specific climate actions are complemented with policy reforms, for example, building resilience through adaptation by phasing out energy subsidies. Another option is to use a programmatic approach with specific commitments as initially proposed by Postil and Sajal Patel. And we can also think about facilitating swaps and broader climate financing by standardizing KPIs to reduce monitoring costs and support the broader development of ESG instruments. Carbon credits can also be used to incentivize debt swaps and could potentially create a win-win situation between debtor and creditor countries to the extent that they would promote new projects where they are the most efficient, which may not necessarily be in the donor country, and allow financing that to happen where it would not have happened otherwise. And there's also the possibility of mobilizing coordinated official financing linked to climate action, like in the case of the Just Energy Transition Partnership, which could include swaps as an element. And beyond supporting swaps, these policies would also support the broader climate financing mobilization effort. So while our findings suggest that swaps can be useful in creating fiscal space, they also point to them being, to somewhat being a narrow case on purely efficiency grounds, and so that, but there is a set of circumstances under which debt for climate swaps could be efficient and could represent a useful addition to the climate financing toolkit. And again, especially if grants or debt restructuring are not on the table, and whereas swaps might be for a number of political economy reasons. In that way, policies that support the scaling up of swaps can also help facilitate the expansion of other forms of climate finance. So they will create these other spillovers and be beneficial as well. And these are some of the points that we plan to convey in COP27. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcos. Thank you. And you and the IMF are a welcome addition to the community of thinking and practice in climate, nature, and people. And in closing, I'd like to invite Mr. Jerry Velasquez to provide us with your closing remarks. We are very grateful to the GCF and to WCS for organizing this event. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but we're very glad to have you, Jerry.
Thank you very much. I know that all of the discussions have been very rich. I'm not going to be saying much, but maybe just leave the panelists a few things to consider. I think in the case of Belize, the main question was, what were the risks and what were the costs that you actually faced? And if somebody like the GCF, if you knew from the beginning that we exist to actually take those risks and those costs from you, what would you request from us? Because we knew that there were upfront costs that you had to deal with. The other thing is that even now, I think you are still facing risks in the implementation of the process, either in the structuring of the sub-projects or other risks. And the question is, what do you think we can offer to you to actually take those risks and make this a success? The third question is, how come the other countries, if it's such a good transaction, how come the other countries are not taking this up? What is the barrier for other heads of state and finance ministers to understand this concept better? I think this is the core challenge for all of us in this room. Because when I was in Lisbon at the UN Oceans Conference, everybody was asking us, if it's such a good deal, how come there's only very few examples? So what is the problem? What we need is probably Belize and Seychelles and a few others to come up and show us what did it take for them to get here? What were the risks? And what can funders like the GCF do to take those risks away? Because I know that it took you a lot of effort, took you a lot of time and a lot of money to structure this. Now, if the GCF could come to you and provide you these resources and take those risks from you, what would it be? Because exactly this is what we're trying to do at this moment. And working, of course, with WCS and others, it's not just in oceans, but in forests. And we're also working in the Congo. So I think my main takeaway is that I think we still need to raise a lot of awareness, especially for finance ministers, because I really think if it is something that can work, it should not be done when the country is at the point of bankruptcy. No, it should be done, much, much earlier. And I do realize when I was talking to the Prime Minister of Belize in Lisbon, that he was telling me that it took, I think, 3 or 4 prime ministers to really discuss this concept before it got into play. So the question is, how can we get this into the horizon of decision makers earlier? And in the Caribbean, this is now a big issue. And what would it take for the other Caribbean countries to learn from the experience of Belize, and maybe for working together, scale this up faster and make it a little bit more successful. And just to let everybody know, we are here to actually simply offer our support. We are here to take these risks away from you. We are here to, there's not enough risk capital. We are there to provide the risk capital. There's not enough capital for the transaction costs. We are there to reduce your transaction costs. So thank you very much, and we look forward to working with you.
Thank you, Jerry, and thanks for expressing your support. We're all in this challenge. Before you leave, first I wanted to apologize because we have not been able to take questions. So if you have questions, we'll be happy to answer them if you can just leave them in the app in the WOVA. And also if you can register in the app so we know that you actually came and who actually was here with us, that would be very, very beneficial to us. Thank you again, and we look forward to continuing this conversation. As Jerry expressed, there's more awareness to be made, and we are happy to help with that. Thank you so much. Have a great day.